questions until after we've heard from the other two panelists, and then come back to how it all fits together. Jack, welcome. Can I turn to you next if the technology is working? And I'm going to challenge you to give us an introduction to the history of telework how it's evolved over the last 50 plus years in not more than 5 minutes. Can we hear that?
Has he got his mute on?
He's responding.
Am I up next or what?
You are, yes, Jack.
That is the introduction.
All right. I'll try and do it in at least 4 3/4 minutes. My formal education was as a physicist and engineer, and my initial career began basically managing the design and implementation of a variety of reconnaissance systems for the Air Force. And for much of that career, it was space systems. I was designing payloads for essentially reconnaissance satellites. Now, this went on for about 17 years or so until the late 1960s. And at one point, I was talking with an urban planner who looked at me and said, you know, if you people can put man on the moon, why can't you do something about traffic? Oh, well, I had helped NASA design, pick the cameras to map the landscape of the moon to pick landing spots. So why not traffic? It's just an engineering problem, right? Wrong. I thought about this for a while and tried to talk my company into doing a little research on substituting communications for people to work at home or nearby home instead of having the freeways with traffic twice or more times a day. Company didn't like this. They said, hey, we're engineers, we don't do it. So I moved to the University of Southern California, invented a job called Director of Interdisciplinary Program. And since nobody knew what that meant, I had a fairly free hand in picking people to do the research with me from around the university. Got a grant from the National Science Foundation to develop policy, telecommunications, transportation trade-off in 1983. Excuse me, I dropped a decade, 1973. And we picked an insurance company to try this on because I wanted it done with an actual operating company because they have clear criteria on what works and what doesn't. We ran an experiment. It turned for several months of moving their employees to locations near their homes, what we call satellite offices, working there on dumb terminals connected to their local mini computer. The mini computer would upload their information to the company mainframe downtown, because having people work at home, the telephone costs at that time would be out of hand. The internet had not yet arrived. Anyway, the experiment was a success. We figured the company would save $4 to $5 million a year in reduced turnover rate, not having to replace a third of their employees every year by having them stay there, because the turnover rate went from 1/3 during our experiment to 0. They save on facility costs and so forth. So it was a great success. The company said, we're not going to do it. I asked, why is this? It's because we're afraid we'll get unionized, and we don't want to have the union come by and pick up these satellite offices one by one, and sooner or later we'd get unionized. Well, forget it. A couple of weeks later, I was at a conference in San Francisco with a trainer from the AFL-CIO labor unions, and he said, "You know, this telecommuting that you're calling it, is a terrible idea." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, if the company's employees are scattered all over the countryside like you having them work, how will we ever get them organized?" They turned it down because they're afraid of the union. The union turned it down when it's afraid they can work. Anyway, this sort of attitude worked. I spent the rest of the decade trying to get more support from this, from government agencies and so forth. And finally, in the mid 1980s, we were able to attract several Fortune 100 firms to try this out, IBM and AT&T among them. And again, they had successful projects, but they didn't want us to tell them and to say anything about them, because if you've got a great idea to do something at low cost and it produces year after year returns in terms of lower costs and improved productivity, why tell your competitors? And this is the same tune. It made me decide what I want to do is get some public sector companies to do this so I can talk about it to people. So we started in the mid 1980s, started recruiting public sector organizations, and finally the state of California climbed on board. We had a project that ran 3 years from the 1987 to 1990. Same results. Productivity went up, turnover rate went down, the state would save money, and so forth and so on. And it was a great success. But the next governor turned it down because he didn't want people doing strange stuff like that, they working where people can't see them all the time. So same problem. Management resistance was the big barrier to having all this happen. We did another experiment with the city of Los Angeles. The mayor supported it. We had good results, pretty much the same as the state of California. The new mayor came in, stopped the program. Same reason. I want people to come in the office where I can see them, and so forth and so on. So this went on throughout the 80s and 90s. I spent a lot of time commuting to Europe, talking to various groups around Europe under the auspices of the European Commission about how telecommuting was good for business and they should work on it. By the way, I had 2 words I used: telecommuting, because that attracts the commuters who are tired of inhaling the fumes from the car ahead of them when they're stuck in traffic. But the company they work for couldn't care less about that. The company was interested in working, so I call it telework. So both sides would be satisfied with what would happen. Anyway, throughout this whole period, all of the problems we've had were in convincing management that this would work for them. And I kept looking for a magic elixir that would turn this around. And finally, out of the blue, it appeared, something I hadn't anticipated at all. It's called COVID-19. Overnight, hundreds, thousands of companies had to get their employees to work at home because working together, they would get COVID, and then a substantial fraction of them might die of it. I was of two minds about this. One is I was happy to see that teleworking had finally picked up forcefully, as it turned out, and on the other hand, some apprehension that most of these companies had no clue about how to manage it properly, and I was very worried that we'd see a bunch of failures and so forth. But as it turned out, in the years since 2020, companies have quickly adapted to this working at home. Many managers still wanted them to come back to the office, and over the last year or so, the battle has been on between the employees who really like working at home and are willing to go to the office some of the time, but not all of the time, and the managers who want them back full time, but are now finally relenting, so that currently the average rate of people working from home is roughly about 30% to 50% of them are there, half time. They're spending half time at home and half time in the office, which corresponds with a survey we did in the year 2000 of teleworkers around the United States, and that turned out to be about the average, and about half of them were working half time at home, half time in the office. And this seems to be the trend, and it's sticking, and it's been the same for about the last year or so. And with that, I'll put my 4.5 or 6 minutes or yeah. Well, that stopped everybody cold, I guess.
Hi, we're just going to have to unmute the livery room, so just bear with us. Thank you, Jack.
Okay.
Are we unmuted?
Yes.
I don't know, we can go yellow. Thank you, Jack. If you can hear me, we'll come back to you with some questions at the end. Chris, hopefully you can hear me too, and we'd like to move on to you next.